finishing on time because I had several cups of tea before I got up here, so I won't be talking a lot, which is good. That's actually might be a good technique to make sure all the speakers stay on time. Is have them chug some water or something beforehand. So anyway, I was inspired by some of the talks I saw, some very interesting things, particularly Roberto's talk yesterday. I thought, with some history of Mexico and the pearls of mezcal, which we experimentally tested last night. I thought that was very interesting. And related to that, I thought Danielle had mentioned in his talk at the very end that he was interested in looking at emulsions like mayonnaise. And I have an interesting little history lesson about Mexico and mayonnaise, actually, that I can share with you. No, but I'll share with you at the end of the talk, depending on the time. But again, getting back to Roberto's talk and the pearls of mezcal, I thought, it was a nice melding of science in Mexico, so I was inspired by that. So I thought about maybe changing my talk, being from the United States, talking about the bubbles of Budweiser, but I thought maybe not. So I decided to skip that. And instead, I'll talk about continuum modeling of powder flow, blending, and segregation. And if you've seen any of my presentations previously, I'm primarily a DEM person. But recently, I've been getting more involved in continuum modeling of powders. I think there's a lot of potential there. And so I wanted to give a little bit of an overview of some of the things that my students have been working on recently. And the two students are Yulu and Kunal Pardikar. And then I'm also working with a colleague of mine, Marcial Gonzalez. We're all in mechanical engineering at Purdue. The motivation here really is we wanted to develop a quantitatively predictive model for granular materials, for flow, mixing, and segregation at industrial scales. I've been doing a lot of work that's been industrially motivated, industrial sponsors. And so I'm particularly interested over the last 5-10 years on trying to develop things that are actually useful for practicing engineers. I think that's I try to instill that in my students, that the work we're doing, we're here to hand it off to the next group of people who will use it. So we want to try to make sure we're doing things that are industrially useful. And we want them to be quantitatively predictive. For a long time, the very beginning of DEM modeling, most of the comparisons with experiments have been qualitative. Wow, this looks the same as that, so that it must be working well. But we want to try to make it more quantitatively predictive. So the state of the art in powder flow, and especially in mixing and segregation, is dealing with discrete element method simulation. So here you model individual particles. You all are familiar with this. You get the dynamics of the macroscopic system as well as local behaviors simultaneously. At best, right now, these simulations can model on the order of maybe 10 million particles at best. Most people who are using these things in practice are probably modeling on the order of 10,000 to 100,000 particles, so much smaller. But if you think about how many particles there are in maybe an industrial system, so a 1,000-liter container, 100 micron particles, we're dealing with 10 to the 12th particles. So we're still 5 orders of magnitude away, right? So we've got a long way to go. And computers are getting faster. Everything is going great computationally, but we've got a long way to go. Even if we do get closer and closer, the models used in DEM are greatly oversimplified typically. We're dealing with spheres. Shape effects aren't normally included, especially at those big scales. Contact force models are oversimplified typically. A lot of assumptions going on. Another big thing that people don't often talk about is the measurements of material properties of particles. Imagine measuring what's the coefficient of restitution of an irregularly shaped 10 micron particle. People are guessing. Rolling friction coefficients, purely guessed. And actually, what's kind of interesting about that is often those values for those parameters are hidden. They're buried through references. So someone cites a paper where they used a rolling friction coefficient of 0.005, and then they go back and they reference someone who used that value, so on and so forth, until you find the first paper and they said, we don't know what to use, we're going to use 0.005. Okay? No, this happens all the time. So that's a big challenge. And the other thing specifically for blending, blending rates are dependent on particle size. If you look at how fast particle systems blend, the particle size is an important parameter. So if you use particles that are too big, it may not be quantitatively accurate. All this being said, I don't want to dismiss DEM. It has very good use, very good understanding. In some cases, it is quantitatively useful when you're dealing with big particles like in pharmaceutical tablet coating and things like that. So it's still very useful, and I think it's particularly useful for looking at things at the local scale. And that's what you're going to see from this talk, is we're combining kind of macroscopic scale models with microscopic scale models which come from DEM. So with that being said, the other way we can do things is develop continuum models. These are able to access industrial scale systems, so much bigger because you're not tracking individual particles. But you need a constitutive relation relating the stresses and strains or strain rates. You know, we need some kind of relation there. Unfortunately, it's not clear what you're supposed to use. Peter Kundal, who's a big one of the founders of using DEM, you know, he says there's an impressive catalog of constitutive relations that have been devised. There are many hundreds in use, and they can be extremely complicated. Many are phenomenological, so you see some phenomena, and as Raphael had mentioned, you know, you tack something onto your model, and some are quite complicated. We saw one coming out of Sandia National Lab with 76 parameters you had to put into it for it to work. You got to measure all those things, right? So it can be a real nightmare. And I list a few here that people have proposed, and they come out of soil mechanics primarily. Moore Coulomb is a classic, and that's the one that I'll be talking about. Very simple, classic. There are more complex ones like Drucker-Prager-Kapp with hypoplastic models and modifications to include other things. So there's a lot out there. So there's a question of what do you use, and I'll talk about that in a moment. People have been using continuum models for analyzing powder or particulate flows. They generally have been used to model very simple two-dimensional systems, like a chute flow, an annular shear cell, maybe a rotating drum. These where you can make very significant simplifications so you can analyze them by hand. And I give some of the references there. You know, I admire the effort that these folks put into it, you know, the ones I've listed here, but if you actually look at how their models compared to experimental data, it was very poor. Didn't work very well. More recently, people have been doing computational implementations using various constitutive models. The earlier stuff, so this is, you know, in the last 20 years or so, people have been applying it for compaction problems, powder compaction. So tableting and roll compaction, these are common unit operations used in pharmaceutical manufacturing, food processing, things like that. And it's been very successful, the continuum modeling. So like looking at solid fractions within a tablet when it's been compacted. This is a roll compaction simulation. They've been experimentally validated, work very well. They primarily use what's known as a Drucker-Prager-Kapp model, which is an elastoplastic model with 6 parameters. All the parameters vary with the local solid fraction, but it works. If you make those measurements and you do the simulation, it works pretty well. Only recently have people been successful at modeling flow of powder rather than just small deformations. And so there's a big list here related to those. And they've been looking at hopper flows, rotating drums. One was with a bladed mixer. And actually, when we went back through the literature, there was historically there were some people looking at using continuum modeling with FEM, finite element method approach, with a Moore Coulomb model for studying hopper flows back in the late 90s. Didn't have very much success at all, but that's been revisited primarily out of the group in Australia, but Abing Yu's group, where they started using it, and they've had very good success. And then we've kind of gotten on board as well to see how useful, you know, we just want to verify and test ourselves to see how well it works, and it seems to work pretty well, surprisingly. And I'll show you the kind of things that we've been doing. So our contribution has been not just to look at the flow of the powder, but we're specifically interested in blending and segregation. And we call it a multi-scale model. I've caught some flack for that term. But the reason I call it multi-scale is because we have one scale, which is the macroscopic scale, which is really the bulk flow behavior of the powder. So the advective flow field, just the bulk flow, you don't see the individual particles. This is the continuum part. This is where we use a constitutive model with FEM to get the general flow behavior. And then we combine that with models coming from a microscopic scale. This is where for blending, we're looking at the local diffusive behavior of particles. We call it diffusive, dispersive, but the literature calls it diffusive behavior. So how particles are moving around or how they segregate relative to one another. That information typically has come from, recently has come from DEM simulations to look at that very local scale. And you could get some of that information through cleverly designed experiments as well. So we just combine those two together using an advection diffusion segregation equation. So in this equation, C is a concentration, V would be your advective flow velocity coming from the FEM continuum model, D is a diffusion coefficient, it comes from the DEM simulations, and VP is a percolation segregation velocity, so how fast particles, percolation segregation is when you shear the bed of material, let's say large and small particles, how quickly the small particles fall down in the direction of gravity. Okay, so it's one type of segregation. And so we combine them together this way and just solve this numerically. Right now, our modeling is one-way coupled. So we run this and get our flow field, and then take these relations, and then we solve this. We don't care about at this point how changes in concentration affect the flow field. It's something we can do, but we haven't done it yet. As far as the microscopic scale, so how we get those diffusion and segregation relations, those have actually, for us, they've come from the literature. There's been some fantastic work coming out of Northwestern University where they've actually, so I list some of the papers, there are many more, where they've actually used free surface kind of heat flow experiments and many, many DEM simulations where they have a well-defined flow field here, just a very thin shear flow on the surface here. They have a mix of particles coming in over here, and then they look at how they segregate out or mix as they go downstream, and they've done this for different size ratios, different flow rates, a whole bunch of different things, different concentrations. And so they can get relations for diffusion and segregation constants that I showed in the previous slide, and then they've extended it to rotating drums and some other things. But we've done some similar things, but also with, instead of these geometries, we used a shear cell. So anyway, you can get those, the correlations for diffusion and segregation from previously published literature based on some of the things I've shown here. As far as the diffusion coefficient, it's actually a diffusion tensor. Turns out the off-diagonal components, people have shown those aren't very important. The diagonal components, they're just basically the diffusion constant is related to some constant times a shear rate times a particle size squared. And then there's a small contribution, it turns out, well, there's a contribution due to other directions. And again, previous work has shown what how K2 is related to K1. K1 in this relation can be found from, again, some calibration. So again, all coming from the literature, nothing that we've developed. The segregation correlations, again, come from the literature, comes from that work in Northwestern. The percolation speed of one species of particles, this is in the direction of gravity, is related to some constant, which is related to particle size and particle size ratio, a shear rate, and then the concentration of that species. And again, this basically just came from a whole bunch of DEM simulations, and it seems to compare well with, it's a correlation, they just fit to some of the data, and it seems to work pretty well. So we made use of both of those expressions in our model. So the macroscopic scale model, let me talk about that. We modeled the powder as being an elastoplastic Moore Coulomb continuum, the easiest thing we could use, just motivated by what we've seen in the literature, and also by the fact that, so we have experience with those powder compaction simulations with the Drucker-Prager-Cat model. Again, 6 independent parameters that all vary with the local solid fraction, so you have to measure it for a variety of solid fractions. It's a big calibration effort. We've done a lot of work with the pharma industry, and they typically don't want to give us so much powder so we can measure that. It's just, so we wanted to simplify, see what we could get away with. And this kind of goes back to some of the things in yesterday's talks, is let's not have the perfect model, let's have a model that works well enough, okay? So with the more Coulomb model, it's basically you have a normal stress, shear stress on the material. This is a failure plane. If you stay inside here, it behaves elastically. Once you hit the failure plane, then you start to shear the material, and how it shears is based on a flow rule. We use a non-associated flow rule, which I won't get into. There's an internal friction angle, cohesion value. It's a very simple kind of model. And we're implementing that kind of model in a commercially available FEA package. Abacus is explicit, again, with the idea of technology transfer, trying to hand this off to the next group of people. As far as getting material properties at the macroscopic scale, that more Coulomb model, it's just calibrated, the material parameters are calibrated with standard tests, shear cell test and a uniaxial compression test. So we did experiments to measure some of the materials. We also did these kinds of shear cell test with DEM simulation because we compared some of our results to DEM results. So we just ran these types of experiments in the DEM simulation, so we made sure we used the right corresponding bulk level behavior properties. One thing I should point out is that our Young's modulus and Poisson ratio values, turns out the results are very insensitive to those parameters. So you can almost use about anything and it seems to work just fine. So let me just say a few assumptions about the more Coulomb law. So it's isotropic, so you can't deal with elongated particles. The stresses are independent of strain rate, so it's all quasi-static. There's no strain rate dependence there. No shear localization, so you don't get the formation of shear bands that you see often in particulate materials. No hardening or softening behavior. All the material properties are constant. In this particular version of what I'll show you, the advective flow field is independent of the local material concentration, so we don't have any feedback when the concentration changes. And of course, it's only a granular flow. There's no fluid effects in here. The reason I wanted to show this is, A, it's important for you to know that, but B, I've caught some, again, more flack about using this simple model because people who deal with these constitutive models say, oh, no, this is too simple. You have to have this effect, this effect, this effect, this effect. Something super complicated. And what you find is that this simple model seems to work pretty well on its own. You don't have to have all those effects in there to get something that's reasonable. It's been hard to get certain academics to accept that. But anyway, not anyone here. But so anyway, just a quick pictures of what we have here. Here's just a rotating drum. This is a FEM simulation. These are corresponding DEM simulations. The color scales are the same. These are just all speed magnitudes. So you can see qualitatively, looks pretty good. A hopper flow, conical and a wedge-shaped hopper flow. Qualitatively, it looks pretty good. But I have more quantitative data later. One of the first things we looked at was a 2D rotating drum. We looked at mixing. So here we compared against the DEM model because it was easy to control we had all the parameters in the DEM model and we could get the measurements straight easily. So on the left side is the DEM model, just red and black particles are all identical except for color. The right-hand side is the FEM model. And what we did is we incorporated only the diffusive blending. There's no segregation in this. The parameters that we use here came from the shear cell tests of the DEM particles. So that's the more Coulomb parameters came from those simulations from DEM. The diffusion constants came from the Northwestern work. We didn't backfit any data. It was all data coming from independent sources. And so what you'll see, just show a little movie. On the right-hand side, you're just seeing the concentration of red particles, where yellow is a lot of red particles, blue is no red particles. So, qualitatively, looks pretty good. It's mixing. That's great to see. And then we did some more quantitative measurements. What we did is we just took a line down from the free surface, had some cells here, and then counted the concentration of red particles. We did that for the FEM simulations and the DEM simulations. So the red are the DEM simulations, the blue are the multi-scale model with the FEM. And so these are at different times through the rotation. You can see pretty good match here. So, I mean, it works pretty well. There's a little offset. We think that offset's because we didn't get the free surface angle was off by about a degree or two between the two models, so it kind of offsets things. So that worked pretty well. And then, since it was mixing we were interested in, we also measured a segregation index, or intensity of segregation, which is basically just a measured variance of the variance you'd get if it was completely segregated. It's a standard way to measure mixing or segregation. If the value is 1, it means, if this value is 1, it means it's completely segregated. If it's 0, it's completely randomly blended. So the dashed line was our FEM model prediction, our multi-scale model prediction. And the other lines here are the DEM simulation results, just using different box sizes, because it turns out, because of the finite size of particles, the segregation index depends on the size of your box. Works pretty well. And again, no fitting going on here. This was all, independent measured tests. One interesting thing is that the multi-scale model actually will eventually go to 0, whereas in the DEM simulations, because of the finite size of particles, it won't go to 0. So the model works pretty well out here, but for long times, you'll have a little bit of an offset. But we know what the final result should be. If you just from probability, there's a randomly mixed variance value here, so you can actually calculate when you can turn off the simulation and you approach the randomly mixed value. So that works pretty well. We're pleased to see that. So then we decided, okay, let's push it. The previous work was two-dimensional, nominally steady. So then we went to 3D and unsteady. So here we modeled a tote blender, this kind of shape, and it rotates about that dashed line axis. We did this particular blender because there was some experimental data in the literature out of Rutgers where they used some glass spheres and made measurements of the segregation. And actually, they made a relative standard deviation measurement of mixing. But anyway, so they did some side-to-side loading of the material and top-to-bottom loading, and also did different fill levels. So we used the same kind of model, that we did the FEM model, because we can deal with unusual geometries. We used the same blending model, just with the same diffusion coefficient. The difference here was now we actually have a real material, so we didn't want to use the DEM-derived diffusion coefficients coming from the Northwestern work. So we actually went in the lab, had an undergrad build a rotating drum experiment with red and blue particles. These were glass spheres, just like the Rutgers work. Rotated around, saw how it mixed, did some video analysis to get what the concentration of the particles was, and then we ran the same multi-scale mixing model. And then for this geometry, we backfit. What constant for the diffusion coefficient should we use to make it fit best for real glass spheres? And we got a value for the K1 value and the diffusion constant. We got 0.01. By the way, just the DEM-derived ones for ideal spheres was 0.04. So it turns out it's not that far away. But we wanted to use an experimentally measured value. So we ran the simulations. This is just showing kind of the FEM work. I don't even know why I'm showing these pictures because it's hard to see what's going on. But we were looking at here, this is the concentration of particles for the side-to-side loading at different times. It's hard to see how well they mix. But side-to-side mixing, as you might imagine, is terrible. Top-to-bottom mixing is great. But I have a more quantitative comparison, and that's here. So the top two plots are side-to-side. This is 40% fill, 60% fill. The black dots are the experimental measurements coming from the Rutgers paper. The red dots are from our multi-scale model. And again, we didn't backfit this to their data. This was just all kind of independently measured stuff. The bottom is top-to-bottom filling. Again, 40% fill, 60% fill. It works pretty well. There's a little discrepancy here. One thing about the Rutgers data is they didn't have any uncertainty bars, so I don't know whether this is significant or not. The dashed lines are what's the probability-based prediction of what the best mixing is going to be for random mixing. It works really well, and we don't even have a complicated constitutive relation. Okay. Even with that, again, people give us a hard time. It shouldn't work, but it somehow does. Another interesting thing is if you look at the experiments, one thing that we actually did some experiments of our own to try to measure the mixing on our own. We had trouble with it because every time we'd rotated a couple of revolutions, then we'd use a thief probe to sample so we could get a mixing index. But every time we used the thief probe, we disturbed the powder beds too much that it became impractical. But when we ran those experiments, we noticed we had blue and white spheres, and we noticed there was a dead zone where things didn't mix in the experiments. And interestingly, in the simulations, we saw a dead zone there as well, which was quite interesting. So qualitatively, it produced some interesting similar results. So the last thing I'll talk about is segregation. So the previous work was dealing with just blending, but now we're dealing with segregation. So two different particle species. What you're seeing in this rotating drum simulation is this is a concentration of small particles. So yellow means a lot of small particles. Dark colors mean mostly big particles. And this is kind of a classic thing where as you rotate a drum, the small particles avalanche down the surface and then they collect toward the center. And you get this kind of a stationary behavior after some time. We also did a conical hopper. So this is an axisymmetric hopper. So discharging, you see a collection of coarse particles on the top, and they come discharging out, and at the very end you get some fine particles that come out. We did those two geometries because the Northwestern folks had done DEM simulations of that, so we could compare against it. And then a former student of mine, Bill Ketterhagen, did some experimental work in hoppers with two different size spheres, so glass beads. So we wanted to do that to compare against his data. So now the advection diffusion segregation equation includes both blending and segregation. Again, using a diffusion coefficient coming from the literature and the segregation expression coming from the Northwestern group. So this is a comparison with the Northwestern group DEM simulation data. So what we did is we just took a line down here and looked at the concentration of small particles. The blue dots are from the Northwestern group DEM simulation. We used the same parameters as what they used. And then we got the red line. Pretty good. And then we also did the hopper discharge, comparing against the experimental work of Bill Ketterhagen, where he used glass beads. And what he's plotting here is, this is a discharging hopper. What we did is we collected samples at the exit of the hopper and then looked at what the fraction of, by mass, what fraction is the fines or the small particles. So that's what the vertical axis is. So what you see is that the particles start pretty well mixed, sort of stays at a value of 1. It's what you expect if it's well mixed. And then it drops down a bit, which means that it's primarily coarse particles coming out at the very end. And then that was for mass flow. This is for funnel flow. You see sort of a dip, mostly coarse, and then you get a bunch of fines that come out at the end. So the black dots are the experiments. The red dots are the simulations. What I didn't show here were the error bars on the experiments, but they're about that big. So we're pretty close. What we can't do is actually the very end point in the FEM model because of the continuum. What's happening experimentally is there's just a few particles left as they come out. In the continuum model, there are an infinite number of particles because it's a continuum, so we can't really quite get that far to the very end. But it does a pretty good job. So, summary. Number one, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think that's, it's great. We're all striving to do the best best model we can do, but especially for industrial purposes, sometimes a model just has to be good enough to make a decision. It doesn't have to be. I think a fellow said yesterday, if the models are within 25%, fantastic. So what we did is, again, combined macroscopic and microscopic scale models. We're able to quantitatively predict mixing and segregation compared to some experimental results and DEM results, so that's good. I think a big thing is we can determine model parameters from some independent standard tests. We don't have to necessarily backfit things. So so that's really fast summary. But let me just offer some thoughts since I'm almost out of time. It's difficult to find published papers with all of the parameters that needed to compare your model to. And that's why the experiments here, if you paid close attention, they were glass beads that people used because We have glass beads in the lab. I know what their properties are, more or less. There is data in the literature dealing with powders and such, but I just don't know what all the parameters are for me to model that. So that's an issue. Probably for the short term at least, we'll have to do all of our own experiments simultaneously so we can get those parameters. What about cohesive materials? Since I was dealing with glass beads and such, those are nominally non-cohesive. What about cohesive materials? Well, the model has the capability, the Moore Coulomb model has the capability to include cohesion. As far as diffusion and segregation are concerned, they're pretty much diminished if you have any significant cohesion. You know, the diffusive movement of particles is going to not happen because they're stuck together, and because they're stuck together, they're not going to segregate. So incorporating cohesion for looking at mixing and segregation maybe is not so significant to include those models. I think primarily the flow would be dominated primarily from advection. So whatever mixing occurs is going to be primarily advection dominated. Items to improve. I think we need more validation. Dealing specifically with more powder flows as opposed to big glass spheres. I think there's some issues, you know, how do you calibrate diffusion and segregation parameters in reality when you're dealing with irregularly shaped particles with, you know, widely varying size distributions, et cetera. The blending and segregation work we had was just 2 species. How do you incorporate multiple species? Actually, the Northwestern group's working on that. The segregation work was actually all 2-dimensional. The blending was 3D, but the segregation was 2-dimensional because of the governing relation for the segregation model. That was really derived for 2D, so that needs to be extended to 3D. Two-way coupling is possible, and we've actually started that, where the concentration, as the concentration varies, you can change the material properties and then put that all within the continuum model. So the whole thing's linked together. We started doing that, but there again, you're going to have to make some measurements about how material properties vary with concentration. We just haven't done that part. Do we need more complex constitutive models? I put that one in there to satisfy the people who kind of give me a hard time. So my answer, based on at least what we've done so far, is it doesn't seem to be the case, but we only looked at some simple systems. More complex systems, sure. Maybe there needs to be changes. So possibly, depending on what you need to do, I guess. So with that, I'll go ahead and end. Thank you very much for your time. I'll try to answer a few questions if you have them. Thank you. Yes.